Welcome to Velina's talk on U.S.-China nuclear relations. My guest today is David Santoro, who is president of the Pacific Forum. He specializes in strategic deterrence, arms control, and non-proliferation. David's current interests focus on great power dynamics and U.S. alliances, particularly the role of China in an era of nuclear multipolarity. His new volume, U.S.-China Nuclear Relations, The Impact of Strategic Triangles, was published in May 2021. This podcast is facilitated by Bharatwata, one of India's leading podcast producers for politics, policy, and society. David, welcome to this digital conversation.
Thank you so much, Velina. Thank you for having me. Very glad to be here and looking forward to our talk.
Now, as you can imagine, before we actually elaborate on the US and China nuclear relations, we need to take a look at the current picture on the old continent, where two other nuclear adversaries are more or less engaged in kind of a very serious confrontation. The one being the full-scale war launched by Russia on Ukraine on February 24th. And of course, Ukraine is actually in a situation of war, or has been in a situation of war since 2014. And due to the support coming from the West, the United States, but also the European allies, Ukraine has been showing very strong resistance, and in reality, the Russian troops have withdrawn from the north of the country. Officially, since yesterday, this has been confirmed. Now the war is entering a second phase, and I would like to touch upon this topic with you. What is your assessment, of course, from the perspective of the US strategic interests? How do you anticipate the development of this war, and what does it mean for the United States and also for the relations between the United States and the European allies, given also the possibility or the risk of the use of nuclear weapons? So let's start with first your assessment, then of course anticipation for the future development, and then your also your opinion on the future of the partnership.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think for starters, what it means is that the United States will have to continue to value its relationship with Europe, despite the fact that Asia is quote unquote the priority theater, despite the fact that China is the, again, quote unquote, the pacing threat. The United States will have to remain focused on Europe. And I'm not saying that to say that it was not going to be focused on Europe, but for years now, we've been talking about the so-called pivot or rebalance or shift to Asia. And it's been very difficult from a US standpoint to actually make that pivot to Asia. And, you know, at the, I guess, broader strategic level, what it means, this conflict in Ukraine means is that the United States will have to think long and hard about how it can focus on Asia while having still a very strong relationship with Europe and responding to a very immediate and urgent problem. That's, I guess, the backdrop of what it means for US policy. As far as the war itself is concerned, well, I think clearly the war is not over. I think it's very clear also that Vladimir Putin has had very serious setbacks in its campaign. I think he decided to go for the full country instead of going for I guess more limited objectives in the east of Ukraine, which were bad enough, but going for the full country was too ambitious. And now he's having setbacks. That does not mean that the war is over. And in fact, it could mean an acceleration of the war and an acceleration of, indiscriminate killing of civilians. And we've already seen a lot of that. And we've also seen that Russia is mobilizing a number of people to continue the fight. And so my assessment is quite bleak. I think we unfortunately will see more killings and more destruction. And right now, as far as I'm concerned, I don't see an end in sight for that conflict. The other thing as well is I'm not sure that we in the West, in the US, are able to articulate specifically what it is that we want. We know that we don't want Putin to win, but at the same time, when you hear we can't let Putin win, you also hear, but we also know that he's not going to accept defeat. And so it makes it very, very difficult to reconcile those two realities. And so again, I think at this point, it's very difficult to see an end of that conflict. And so maybe we are in a very tough spot that right now there's no end in sight. So that's for now my assessment. And the other thing that's, I guess, frustrating for me is that the discussion in the West is on the one hand, you have people who argue for more military assistance to Ukraine, more support, basically more, I hate the word escalation, but basically more support for Ukraine. And then on the other hand, you have people who talk about off-ramps to Putin, de-escalation. And so we have a very polarized view of that conflict. It's either you escalate or you don't escalate. And so again, in terms of articulating specific goals, it's been a little difficult. But I don't think anyone has a very clear answer about where we go from here. I would argue that militarily, things can get very serious, and that doesn't mean we shouldn't do anything. And I think I'm personally think that we should absolutely ramp up military assistance to Ukraine in the current situation, but we also have to be very aware of the risks that are involved. So this is unfortunately where we are.
Do you anticipate, because this was also being discussed right from the beginning of the war, the possibility of the use of tactical nuclear weapons? Do you anticipate such a scenario in which Russia would see itself in the position, or would see itself inclined to use nuclear weapons against Ukraine?
So I still consider that risk is fairly low, just because it would be, as you know, and as many people know, it would be a huge red line to cross. Any type of nuclear use, tactical or not, would be crossing a big red line. And so I think it's still low, but I do not exclude that possibility. I think that I can conceive of some scenarios in which, if pushed into a corner, the tactical use of nuclear weapons could make sense from Russia's perspective. That's one option. The other option would be for Russia to use nuclear weapons to basically force or change the dynamic and force Ukraine and others to back down as a demonstration of force. That's another scenario. The other one as well that we are not talking probably enough is the risk of escalation, inadvertent escalation, nuclear escalation, where basically we get into some form of an altercation at the conventional level that very quickly leads to the use of nuclear weapons. Again, I say that not to suggest that we should not continue our military assistance to Ukraine. Again, I want to stress that I think that we should continue doing what we're doing and in fact ramp that up. But I'm sometimes a little concerned that we seem to dismiss too quickly the risk of nuclear use. And I think it's significant that when Vladimir Putin started its campaign and announced his campaign, he very quickly and very explicitly stressed that Russia is a major nuclear armed state and that it should not be messed with. I think this was his terms. Now, that doesn't mean we should not do anything. Again, I want to stress that very much. But the reality is that Russia has multiple options, and so this is not a risk we should ignore. So low risk, but not an impossible risk. And I think the lesson for us is that we can do a lot to help Ukraine, but there are also hard limits to how much we can help, because we are sort of we want to help so long as there is no escalation, certainly not to the nuclear level. And so our willingness to help is limited by that factor. And so every time we deal with certainly a major nuclear armed states, we are de facto limited in our ability to respond or to provide assistance to a state so that that state can respond to aggression.
Mm-hmm. Also, if you look back at the nuclear relations between United States and Russia before the full-scale war on Ukraine was launched, it was kind of a precarious situation already. I mean, the New START treaty between the U.S. and Russia was seen as this last surviving pillar of nuclear arms control. And obviously, even though that they managed to agree on a kind of prolongation of the New START until 2026, and to start at some point of time discussing and addressing the topics and conflictual issues, also about the kind of weapons that this future treaty should and could entail. Obviously, the even bigger target for the United States was actually to use Russia as a negotiation party to also bring China to the negotiation table, which obviously did not succeed, but it was kind of a already precarious period for the bilateral relations between America and Russia. And I would like to hear your opinion and also your assessment on the nuclear relations, specifically given the new developments. How do you anticipate that they will actually shape and facilitate this relationship? What is also your expectation for the future of this last surviving pillar of the nuclear arms control?
Not good would be the short answer. We've seen the U.S. Russia relationship going from bad to worse, really, and that, by the way, predates 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea. Across the board, not just in nuclear issues, the relationship again has really very seriously deteriorated. And as you rightly said, New START is basically the only arms control, U.S.-Russia arms control treaty that remains in place. It was renewed, and now we have 5 years of that treaty still being alive. But given the fact that the strategic stability dialogue is in jeopardy, people, Russians and Americans, are not meeting anymore. It's unlikely to be renewed. And in addition to this, I don't think we have any guarantees that the inspections that are part of New START will continue. In fact, I heard some people say that there were already, some signals that might actually stop. So even though the treaty might remain in place until 2026, it might be, brain dead, if you will. It might actually not be active. So the reality is we are really, even certainly politically, but also from an arms control standpoint, not having a relationship with Russia anymore. And so we are in a very, very bad place. Now, I want to, I guess, stress that there are still a number of channels, essentially crisis management channels, that exist between the United States and Russia that can be used, should a very serious crisis happen, so that there can be communication or channels of communication. But as far as arms control is concerned, so limits or reductions of specific weapons, that's not going to happen. And so the future, really, the way the future looks like for that relationship is no more limits or reductions or codes to limit weapon developments. So this is where we are. And you mentioned China in that context as well. I don't see any avenue for the U.S. China strategic relationship to be used as a leverage to bring China into the arms control fold. And as you know, this was one of the discussion point, at least, from the previous U.S. administration. And the administration talked about trilateral arms control, and then said that we could have two bilateral avenues, one on USRussia, one on U.S. China, that would eventually merge into a trilateral, arms control relationship. That is not happening, and it's not happening because of the very bad state of U.S.-Russia relations, on the one hand, and on the other end of the spectrum, China has made it very, very clear that it is not interested in arms control, and so where we are is, maybe the very likely death of arms control. Now, it can probably be revived at some point, but right now, today, if you're looking not too far over the horizon, arms control could very well die.
It can be also seen as a kind of a reminiscent from the Cold War, and given the new kind of systemic rivalry emerging between the United States and China, one possible avenue for this bilateral confrontation could be could take place in the area of nuclear armament. So, do you anticipate this kind of Cold War 2.0 confrontation in the field, specifically in the field of nuclear weapons, where China would seek to catch up with technological breakthroughs, and also to continue with nuclear armament? But then again, of course, what you've outlined, these two difficult relationships the United States is currently faced with and confronted with, on the one side with Russia, but also on the other side with China, in the field of nuclear weapons, whether this would also result in a kind of a very complicated strategic triangle where Russia and China would be actually inclined to even cooperate first and foremost with each other, but then also with third parties. And here I think, of course, of North Korea, but also Iran, where they've been pushing for the JCPOA. But on the very same time, if you look at what Iran has been doing in the meantime, after U.S. withdrew from the JCPOA, And right now, we are still, awaiting the conclusion of this Iran deal 2.0. Obviously, Iran has been preparing also for nuclear, for further nuclearization, and the risk of getting nuclear weapons is actually has become higher. So, how do you see this kind of relationships evolving in this transitionary period of the international relations?
Sure. Let me address, I guess, the first part of your question about China, and then I'll get to the multilateral piece. On China specifically, so China has been modernizing its nuclear arsenal for years. This is in many ways not a new phenomenon, but in very recent years, it's been basically it's been conducting a buildup, a crash nuclear buildup. And last year, if you recall, a number of independent organizations, through satellite imaging, managed to show that China was actually developing its arsenal a lot faster, and was going through a much bigger buildup than what was originally anticipated. And so again, we've known that China has been modernizing for years, but not that it was modernizing so much in so little time, over the past few years. So the Chinese arsenal is becoming a lot bigger. In addition to this, China has been improving as well, perfecting its arsenal from a qualitative standpoint. So it's been developing new platforms, making its missiles a lot more, road mobile missiles, developing subs, improving its command and control systems. So what we are seeing right now is a China that is increasingly becoming a very capable nuclear state, not only from a quantitative standpoint, but also from a qualitative standpoint. And this is actually something that's very new, because 10 or 20 years ago, we used to regard, at least we in the United States, used to regard China as a nuclear problem, but as a future nuclear problem. And where we are today is at a point where China is a very present problem, and a problem that will only get bigger for the United States. So that's the China problem. Now, as we've just discussed, the United States also has a Russia problem. So for the first time I would argue it's in nuclear history, the United States is facing two very capable nuclear armed states that are not friendly. Now, I don't think that, despite the fact that Russia and China have been increasing their cooperation essentially since the end of the Cold War, and it's never really stopped. In fact, I would argue it's increased in recent years. I don't think that they are at a point where they are prepared to cooperate at the nuclear level. Having said that, the fact is the United States now faces two nuclear armed states. Even though they're not cooperating, the United States has to factor that in, that it has two very capable states in different regions that are considered absolutely critical to the United States. And so this is a new problem that, frankly, we haven't actually begun to appreciate. We haven't internalized how to address it. And I would guess that the upcoming U.S. nuclear posture review, which I think will be released within the next few weeks, will address that problem. We'll look at what it means specifically for the United States, because again, this is very new. As for North Korea and Iran, which you also mentioned, I think those are clearly problems, but they will be considered, or they are considered, as secondary problems from a U.S. standpoint. It doesn't mean that they are not important, but I think Washington will look at addressing first the Russia and China problem in the nuclear sphere. just because they are much bigger and much more consequential problems than the other two.
I would like to ask an additional question just to unpack it a little bit. Do you foresee a possibility for a kind of threat multiplier? That means a coordinated effort or coordinated actions between China and Russia in this particular field, given the fact that they know that this would create a really serious problem for the United States to tackle. That means, of course, because China is not included in newly emerging arm, or at least right now, there is no way how China can be included into a new kind of nuclear arms control regime. At the very same time, the nuclear arms control regimes from the Cold War are more or less dying off, and even the one final pillar is not, that has been, of course, prolonged, is going to expire at some point of time. I do not see how the relations between the United States and Russia will be actually, better off in 5 years from now, to have enough incentives for both to negotiate. So, given also the deterioration of the nuclear relations between Moscow and Washington, isn't it a kind of a very dangerous terrain for the United States to operate? Where do you see a potential added value coming from allies in that specific context?
Sure. So first of all, no, at this point, I do not see the potential for Russia-China nuclear cooperation. I don't think that they are there. In fact, not at all. I would even argue that in many ways, they worry about each other in that space. Now, that said, I will say that I don't think it's impossible that should there be a very serious war like we have right now, but it's possible to imagine that if we have a problem in Europe, then it creates a window of opportunity in Asia. In other words, I don't think it's impossible to imagine China taking advantage of the problem we have in Europe to make moves in Asia. Now, and I know what everybody is thinking. It's thinking of the Taiwan question, but I think there's other scenarios that can be imagined as well. So this is, I guess, how we describe this problem. I also think that it has posture problem from a U.S. standpoint. It requires a very serious reflection on the implications for U.S. forces, U.S. nuclear forces, and conventional forces as well, because again, it's facing two major nuclear armed states. And one of the ways the United States can address that is by basically relying a lot more on its allies. This was already something that the United States was pushing for, basically encouraging Asian and European allies to take on a much greater share of the deterrence and defense burden. And the reality is, given what's going on, this is even more important and more urgent. And specifically when it comes to Europe, I think that the priority for the United States is to have European allies to take on an even greater share of that burden, because the United States still worries about Europe, will still need to have a role in ensuring the continuity of a European security order that benefits itself and its allies. But the priority needs to go to Asia. And therefore, the United States will need to be a lot more involved in Asia. It will still require its Asian allies to take on a greater share of that burden as well. The burden sharing will need to increase as well in Asia. but it's especially important from a US standpoint to have European allies to be a lot more active, given the fact that the pacing threat, quote unquote, again, is China, and that's not going to change from a US standpoint. And so moving forward, I think this is one way to look at it. The other thing I'll say as well is, deterrence can be done in many different ways. And I know we're talking about nuclear issues here, but I would argue that allies can, by beefing up conventional deterrence, allies in Europe and allies in Asia, would basically help strengthen the US and their own posture significantly. And so it's not just, we don't need to just change or adapt US nuclear posture. I think a lot of it is about beefing up the conventional deterrence piece of the equation.
Well, there is definitely a watershed moment on the old continent when it comes to the attitude towards defense spending following the launch of full-scale war by Russia, and now we are observing a kind of increasing readiness in various European capitals to spend more in the defense, in the field of defense, which hasn't been, anticipated before that. I mean, this was obviously a huge problem for the European partners. However, also when it comes to the attitude towards nuclear weapons and hosting weapons of mass destruction here on the old continent, there will be also, I think, the need for a kind of a shift in the strategic thinking. And given what you said about the shifting focus by the US on the Indo-Pacific, do you foresee actually an increased role on the side of the European partners when it comes to nuclear weapons? And do you foresee also a kind of shift in the way they actually think about it? Because obviously, different member states of the European Union have a very different attitude about nukes. And this has been really a serious issue in the political debates of many of the capitals. Also, 98% reduction to today's stockpile of nuclear weapons following, the end of the Cold War is a serious, put them in a serious situation now that they are facing a much more assertive Russia, which would even be inclined to use tactical nuclear weapons if it feels threatened and if it seeks to succeed in this war. So what is your take about the European powers and their attitude towards nuclear weapons? Also, obviously, right now they are a kind of a missing geopolitical puzzle piece in this nuclear relations between U.S., China, and Russia.
Sure. 10 years ago, and maybe 10, 12 years ago, as you know, the discussion about nuclear weapons in Europe was all about consolidation of U.S. tactical nuclear weapons, whether or not to remove them, how to do it. That's not the debate anymore. So I don't see that, given what's going on with Russia, and certainly in the context of the Ukraine conflict. So I think that debate is dead right now. It's not going to change. I do not see a need to increase nuclear deterrence in Europe. And by that I mean, I don't think that the United States needs to deploy additional nuclear weapons in Europe. Mm-hmm. I don't think that this should be the priority. I think there's a conventional response that needs to happen more so than a nuclear response. There's a lot of things that the United States can do, and certainly that U.S. allies can do. And I think this would be a lot more efficient. For that matter, this is the same priority in Asia as well. What you see in Asia is allies increasingly interested in discussing nuclear issues and extended nuclear deterrence with the United States, because they feel that they need to be involved in those discussions, involved in planning, maybe even to some extent in operation. And there's a very active debate in South Korea about whether or not Seoul should develop its own nuclear weapons. But from my perspective, this is not really. This would be, more damaging than opting for other options. So, beefing up extended nuclear deterrence is certainly something that can happen, and that I would argue should happen. In fact, I've argued for quite a long time that this is the next strengthening agenda. This is, we've strengthened extended deterrence by, basically asking allies to do more at the sub-conventional level, at the conventional level as well. And now we're at a point where we need to actually do more in sharing the way we think about nuclear weapons from a deterrence perspective. And so we should do all this, but when it comes to the development of actual capabilities to respond to what's going on, whether you're in Europe or in Asia, I think the priority should be given to conventional deterrence. And as I said, there's a lot that can be done in that space. And I'll add as well that if you follow the U.S. national security debate right now, the key term is integrated deterrence, which is, from my perspective, another way of saying deterrence. But the reality is that from a U.S. perspective, it wants deeper integration between itself and its allies when it comes to deterrence issues. And so what it means is that, again, it's the whole burden sharing arrangement. We need allies to do more, to be better integrated with us, because the less daylight you show to your adversary, the more likely you are to have a strong deterrent effect. And so that's the way to think about deterrence, integrated deterrence, if you want to use the buzzword. But moving forward, this is the goal. And so, yes, it has a nuclear component, but it's really going to happen at the conventional level.
Mm-hmm. If I think in terms of strategic triangles, I would point to two problematic triangles. Problematic, of course, from the perspective of the US and the US interests. The one being obviously the triangle between China, India, and Pakistan, where nuclear weapons are also involved in South Asia, and the other one being the triangle China, North Korea, Russia, when it comes to also the involvement of nuclear weapons. How is the United States, from your perspective, of course, actually dealing with these two, very different, of course, strategic triangles, but obviously on the one side, China and Russia are supporting for different, of course, for different reasons, are supporting nuclear, the nuclearization of North Korea, but also, of course, are basically building a counterweight to US efforts to deal with the North Korean problem. On the other side, of course, the South Asian strategic triangle, not a new one, and yet, of course, given the new great power dynamics and the shifting global power competition towards the Indo-Pacific region, do you foresee this as being the most significant strategic triangle also for US interests now that the US is preparing for systemic rivalry with China? and is also looking for credible partners and allies in the Pacific region. This kind of shifting actually strategic triangle in the South Asian part is obviously also creating problems for Washington. What is your anticipation and also assessment of the situation?
Sure. So we'll start by saying that the United States history with nuclear weapons began bilaterally. As you know, in the Cold War, the United States had basically one nuclear problem to solve. Not quite right. China emerged, but it was small. It was essentially U.S. Soviet. So in our thinking, it's been bilateral. It's been a bilateral problem to solve. When China emerged China detonated its first nuclear device in 1964, it immediately had several nuclear problems to solve. So it had certainly the United States, the Soviet Union at the time as well, quickly North Korea became a problem. So from a Chinese perspective, and of course, I'm sorry, India was also a concern. So from a Chinese perspective, the multipolarity, the nuclear multipolarity has been a reality essentially since the beginning. That's not been the way we've conceptualized nuclear problems in the West, and certainly not in the United States. And so we haven't actually really thought about how to deal with multiple nuclear problems. We are now, but it's still something that we haven't really conceptualized. So you mentioned South Asia. I mean, the obvious, what I guess you could argue is that Pakistan developing nuclear weapons will generates a response from India. They feed each other in a competition that also impacts China, and China being linked to the U.S.-Russia relationship also feeds that triangle. And so you have basically a systemic arms race going on. I think there's some truth to this. I also think that at the moment, we don't really see a very active nuclear race operating between China and India. There is an element of response between the two, but it's not really active. And so the idea of a nuclear cascade, if you want to use that terminology, is not really active. So there are limits to how much you can link all those triangles. I think they are real. I mean, there's certainly a triangle between, Pakistan, India, and to some extent China, but it's not a perfect sort of cycle of proliferation that feeds is self-feeding and sort of feeds in turn other triangles such as the U.S. Russia-China triangles. But having said that, we are now in a situation in which we have a nuclear multipolar world that we did not have before. And so the question is, whether we can deal with that problem by going bilateral, engage China bilaterally, engage Russia bilaterally, or if you need to bring everyone together to resolve that problem. I don't think that, first of all, I don't think you need willing partners if you want to engage everyone to try and solve those problems. And second of all, you have some discussion that is taking place at the P5 level, so between the United States, Russia, China, France, and the UK, but these discussions have been very limited and have not involved arms control, at least the way we think of it. And so we are at a point where we are not in a risk reduction mindset, and we are basically not controlling that problem. And we've just earlier talked about how arms control is dying in addition to this.
So maybe to wrap it up for our audience, the trend clearly points to actually more nuclear proliferation. I mean, given the fact also that arms control regimes are now, actually become weaker and weaker, and at some point of time, we should also probably expect the old arms control system from the Cold War to actually cease to exist. And of course, given the new great power dynamics, there will be increased tensions between the main protagonists in this great power dynamics that would decrease the incentives for arms control and nuclear non-proliferation. Is it a correct way how to sum it up where we are right now, Adam, in this transitional period?
I think, unfortunately, yes, that's correct. The key terminology from a US standpoint is to talk about strategic stability, or has been to talk about strategic stability, particularly with Russia and China. And I think this is way too ambitious to hope that we can get stability. First of all, we haven't defined what strategic stability is, but you can get an idea of what it means. We are not in a position to hope for stability with Russia or with China. Personally, I like to talk about stabilization, which is another way of saying that we need to avoid the worst dangers of nuclear competition, which really is here to stay. And so, what it means practically is that we are not going to reach stability anytime soon. We are not going to be able to do arms control. The best we can do stabilizing those relationships would be to go through basically to do crisis management. Now, there are problems with this as well, because crisis management assumes that you have willing partners to manage crisis, and I'm not confident that we are there as well. But at least this is a more, I think, reasonable goal than to try and stabilize relationships through arms control, which is completely out of reach, unfortunately, right now.
Mm-hmm. There are already questions coming into the chat, but I would like to ask you two more questions on my side. One being, of course, related to the bigger geopolitical picture. What is your anticipation for the development of this great power dynamics? How do you see the international relations following this transitional period? What is your personal, expectation? Are we entering kind of multipolarity? You already pointed to the nuclear multipolarity. Does this reflect also multipolarity at the level of great power dynamics, or is it going, sole state actor with global power projection, and all the rest of the great powers being in a position of either competing or aligning with this sole global power projection actor? And the second question is, sorry, a little bit too direct, but I really do not have an answer to it, so I would like to hear your opinion. Are we going to witness a nuclearization of the Middle East following JCPOA 2.0? Do you anticipate that other actors, we have Israel with nuclear weapons, and would the JCPOA prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons is, of course, the question that many people ask themselves, including myself. And then, of course, as a reaction to it, are we going to witness a situation in which Saudi Arabia would actually be eager to also acquire nuclear weapons? We've heard about certain cooperation between Saudi Arabia and China. So I would really want to hear your opinion on that.
So on your second question, I think it's not impossible. I think it's probably unlikely But a lot will depend on what the JCPOA 2.0 will be like. I guess if it's a strong agreement, an agreement that is being also, of course, implemented and respected, then the likelihood of the nuclearization of the Middle East is probably low, or lower at least. But if it's not, and or if it's not being implemented, and the nuclear problem continues or even intensifies, then yes, that would be we could see the nuclearization of the Middle East. This is not, I don't think this is something that would be immediate or automatic, but this is a problem. This is a possibility that we should not ignore. Regarding your question about multipolarity, so I think we live in an increasingly multipolar nuclear world. I mean, just because you have more states that are nuclear capable, I don't think that we live in an increasingly multipolar system. We do to some extent, but I think that you still have the same centers of powers that you had a few years ago. So I think that sure, China is gaining a lot of power. It's going to weigh increasingly on the world. And in many ways, if I had to think about what major power relations will be like, I think it's more likely to be I guess, conflict of systems more so than power multipolarity system. So it's probably more that's I think the way I would characterize it, because power is still the West remains very powerful, and sure, others are rising, but the West remains powerful, and it's more about how different systems will compete against each other, I think, moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Now, there is also a question regarding India. What should India do in the future from your perspective? I mean, given this increasing role of China. And also there is a question about the US attitude towards allies. Should the US be more open for the allies to go nuclear? Would that be beneficial for the United States, given that there is already a multi-front scenario for Washington to deal with, not, as you outlined, not with one problem, not with one nuclear adversary, but with several simultaneously. So in a sense, would that be beneficial? This is a question from the chat.
Okay, so on India, I think India will continue to have a very independent foreign policy. I think this is unlikely to change, but I think at the same time, as China is becoming more powerful and maybe more assertive vis-a-vis India, India will naturally lean towards a more forthcoming foreign policy vis-a-vis the West. And so we've seen a lot more interest on the Indian side to engage in the Quad. That's one example. Second example, India has had its so-called Act East policy, which is about engaging Southeast Asia. We've seen the sale of, BrahMos missiles to the Philippines in recent months, and so there's a number of things that I guess we could not really anticipate India would do, but did. I would argue in response to what China has been doing vis-a-vis India. But I still think that despite that, India will maintain a very independent foreign policy. With regard to the allies question, no, I don't think that the United States would benefit if, say, Japan, South Korea, or others would develop nuclear weapons. I think there are better ways to strengthen deterrence. As I mentioned, I think allies can get involved in beefing up conventional deterrence, and this would be a lot more beneficial from a US standpoint, and frankly for the allies themselves as well, despite the fact that, as I mentioned, China is involved in a crash nuclear buildup.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so do you think also that international organizations reflect on the current realities? Because obviously these international organizations are also a kind of institutional reminiscence from the Cold War, and now we are dealing, as you've perfectly outlined, with various states with nuclear weapons, different conflictual interests, no regimes, no regimes to include them and to deal with them. And so, how do you see an exit out of this, situation, or what is your also assessment for the future of international regimes regarding nuclear arms control? Where are we headed to?
I think we've tried to reform the UN for a long, long time and have not really been successful. So, as you well know, I don't see. So, to answer your question, no, I don't think that current international organizations are reflecting the power realities, and more than just power for that matter. But I also think that they are not necessarily useless for this. I think what we'll see is the development of new organizations, and we have been seeing this, the development of the G7, G20, and many others as well have developed precisely because the institutions in place were not successful. And so going forward, we're more likely to see this, not necessarily to see existing not functioning organizations die, but see new organizations that will gradually take on probably more roles and responsibilities to address some of the issues. And the focus of this talk is China. I mean, we've seen China develop a number of organizations as well. Now, we can contest many of them and the practices of these organizations, but they are emerging for a reason, because again, the organizations that are in place right now are not reflecting where the power realities are, and so we're more likely to see that in the coming years.
And speaking of organizations, of course, NATO still this one, major defense alliance that has the DNA, the institutional DNA to deal with, great power competition. At the very same time, there is still this kind of internal debate going on right now as to how to shift the debate towards China, which would be more in the interest of the United States. However, the European NATO members do not actually perceive China as a security threat. And then if we add also the nuclear component, do you think that we will end up with a scenario in which NATO would actually combine China, Russia as a kind of a threat multiplier, so that both partners on the one side, the US, but on the other side, US and of course Pacific allies, but on the other side, the Atlantic, the Euro-Atlantic partners are also satisfied that we basically include both components of this, threat multiplier, namely Russia and China, or are we even end up with a situation where China will basically, replace Russia as threat number one? And second, additional question to it, there have been also speculations about Asian NATO. Do you foresee this kind of scenario for Indo-Pacific or Eastern Asian NATO, for those partners and allies of the United States that feel also increasingly threatened, of course, by China first and foremost, but also by the nuclear threats emerging out of the great power competition?
So on your first question, I think we will see NATO and other European organizations mention China and take China into account in a way that didn't exist before. But I think, especially given what's going on with Ukraine, this is unlikely to be the major focus. I think the primary focus from a defense and deterrence standpoint will, and I would argue should, remain Russia. And from a US standpoint, this is also, I think, where we want European allies to focus on. So that would be my response to your first question. Yes, we will see more about China, but practically probably not much more. On your second question, I get that question quite a lot about Asian NATO. I don't think so, and one of the reasons is that I think this is using the wrong concept, because NATO is obviously a European organization, and it would be wrong to try and solve Asian problems with European solutions. The way the alliance system, the US alliances in Asia were created, do not lend themselves well to the creation of a NATO-like organization. Now, that said, I think there's a lot that can and has been done to strengthen collective defense in Asia, but it's not going to happen through a single organization like NATO. It's going to happen in trilateral formats. So one trilateral mechanism is the US, Japan, Australia mechanism, which has done a lot in the security sphere. We talked about the Quad. That's another mechanism that is also doing important work. The AUKUS arrangement is another one. So it's going to happen through different types of mechanisms, not one single organization like in Europe. So to answer your question, an Asian NATO is very unlikely. It doesn't mean that it's a bad thing. It just means that Asia requires solutions that are different from Europe.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of fluidity in this ad hoc emerging geopolitical security also oriented formations and alliances, and also ad hoc coordinations between states. Obviously, on both sides, quite of an interesting time for the experts of international relations, and quite a frustrating time for the experts on nuclear relations. So for those of you who would like to dive into the US-China nuclear relations, feel free to actually buy the book on US-China nuclear relations, The Impact of Strategic Triangles, which was published in May 2021. And also, dear David, thank you for your insights and analysis on the current nuclear relations and also great power dynamics in global affairs. Thank you also to those of you who joined us and asked questions during the live stream, and also thank you to Bharatvat for facilitating this talk. So this was all from us for today.
Thank you so much, Velina. Thank you, everyone.